So the first two pieces you are going to grab are your collar pieces. Now for this version, I am going to leave my under collar uninterfaced and my top collar interfaced. So you can really see the difference when I hold them up. And the first seam that you are going to stitch is the collar outer edges, right sides together. Now this is where it can get quite confusing. So you see on your collar pieces, you have the lower outward curves. Now, these are the edges that get stitched to the neckline edge. So when I pin my collar right sides together, I am going to start stitching up at this point. This is that notch matching point where we have that circle notch on our pattern piece. So it's tempting to sew down here. So when you have this angled piece at your seam allowance, this is where we are going to stitch. So I'm just going to start pinning with my collar pieces, right sides together. Just making sure to match up those points too. If you really want to locate that exact pivot point, you can grab a ruler and a marking pen and just locate 5/8 of an inch on either side. So right there, I've marked my points, but I just use the guides and the plate on my sewing machine to guide me where to pivot. So when I start sewing my collar, what I want to do is match up 5/8 of an inch to this edge here. And then where my needle intersects my fabric, that's where I'm going to start stitching. You don't want to start stitching right at this edge right here. So I'm going to back it up, line that up, and do a nice back stitch right there. And I'm just following the curve of my collar edge. And then stitch all the way down to the bottom edge. So now it's time to clip and grade our seam allowances. I just like to grade it quite close to the edge and then clip pretty close to that corner too. And before turning it right side out, I like to just give it a quick press so it's nice and warm and those fibers loosen and it's a little bit easier to turn. Sometimes what I even do too is to really get those outer edges crisp. I love a crisp collar, is press them open. So on the inside of my collar, I'm just going to press those little allowances open, and it makes it easier when pressing it with the wrong sides together. And your best friend here will be a point turner as well. So I'm just going to poke those corners. And then I roll those edges right here. Now it will be tempting to top stitch the collar now, but I like to actually top stitch it once it is installed into my shirt with my facing. Next, we need to stitch the shoulder seams of our shirt in order to install the collar. But before you remove your pattern pieces, this notch is very, very important. So I like to take my sharp scissors and cut right to the top of that circle notch right there. So we're cutting right into the fabric. So I have that clipped right there, and I can safely remove my pins. I also like to just notch the center back of my neckline. Just a little clip helps me install my collar too. Make it all nice and even from the back to the front. And to be more efficient, I like to do as much pinning and prepping as I can before heading over to my sewing machine. So I'm just going to set this aside and then also get my facing pieces ready. So I am going to have these right side up and then my back facing. Pinned along the shoulder seams as well. So I'm just going to stitch these two seams as well as my shirt shoulder seams. After I stitched my shoulder seams together, I serged finished the allowances together. If you don't have a serger, just use a zigzag stitch on your regular sewing machine. And then I pressed my allowances to the back. If you wish to press your allowances open, you can totally just serge all of the edges separately first and then go ahead and press them open. And while I was at my serger, I also serged the entire outer edge of my facing just to prevent any fraying, and it's nice and neat on the inside. And I also pressed the allowances for my shoulder seams of my facings open. And I didn't finish them because they are interfaced and this edge will not be exposed inside the garment. So I will put these to the side, but not too far away because we're going to need them after we do our first collar stitch. So I like to put my shirt right side up on my table, and the first pin I place is my collar matching up this edge, that little point that we have with that notch. And I have my uninterfaced collar edge on the inside because this will roll to the outside. So our interfaced one is on the top, our top collar. So I'm going to do my first pin at this point right here, because you can kind of see now this angle going down. So this is where I turn my garment to the other side and I separate that notch and I align that collar edge with my neckline going towards the center front. And so here I do another pin like that, then I spread and then follow along this lower edge. And if it's easier for you, you can baste the bottom collar pieces together first before you do this step. Actually, I didn't notch. If you want to just quickly notch the back of your collar, you can match up the back of your neckline. I don't like to go back to my pattern and notch it. Just fold your collar in half and you have the center point. So I'm going to walk my piece around. Matching up those notches. The neckline will ease a little bit into, because of the bias of that curved neckline, you're going to have some slight stretching. So that's why it's nice to have these center back notches so you get an even stretch on either side. And don't be shy about pinning. This is probably the most difficult seam in the entire shirt. And then when we get around to the other one, I like to just go back to the front. And so I have my notch here and I have this pointed edge. I'm going to place that down there. pin up, flip, and then spread the notch so it matches up with each edge on either side of that clipping. And then I just lay it down. I already have my center back pinned, and then I just ease my collar in. Now I am going to stitch this collar to my neckline, but not at my 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, because we are going to be stitching this seam again only with the facing. And to avoid seeing that stitching line, I am going to stitch this at 1/2 of an inch. And you could even do a basting stitch length as well. So what I'm going to do is stitch my collar to my shirt with my shirt actually as the piece that's facing up, because we really want to make sure we pivot at that slit. So don't try and stitch your collar with your collar piece up, because we really want to see that V. And I'm going to start stitching right here. So I can feel from the shirt side that groove of my collar edge. I'm going to start stitching right there, pivot. So all the way around here, pivot here, and then end my stitch right there. So just go slow and you'll be fine. So when I get to this slit right here, I'm going to take out my pin from underneath and go right to the bottom there. And then I'm going to pivot around and shift some of my fullness out of the way and continue on stitching. So now I'm approaching our second slit, and I'm just going to come up here, and the fullness is kind of facing me now, and I'm going to carefully remove my pin from the bottom. And you kind of want this slit, you want that little edge, that soft point, to be in the center of that slit too. So I'm just going to slowly approach my needle right at the base of that slit and pivot, getting that fullness out of the way, flattening it. And then stitching just till I can feel that collar edge underneath. You can see our collar sewn here, and when it's laying flat and stitched, that slit naturally lies flat and open, and you can see that pivot like so all along here. And so now the next step is to grab your facing. We're going to make a collar sandwich, as I like to call it. So we are going to lay our shirt right side up with our collar here, and I'm going to grab my facing piece, and if you, like I just did not clip into my notch before I removed my pattern piece, sometimes I just don't listen to myself too. It's easy. I always have my pattern pieces right by my side as I'm sewing. I don't put them away until my garment is finished. So I'm just going to line this up, my facing piece, and just cut right into that notch, 2, not 3. So I like to use the top of that circle as my guide. I'm going to flip it here. And I just saw where my clipping mark was, so I can just follow that guideline. So I lay my shirt like this, and I take my facing, and I do the same thing. I match the shoulder seam. So I take my shoulder seam, and I locate the shoulder seam of my shirt and pin those first. And then we come along. So now what we're going to do when we're working our way to the center front, we do that same slit separation. And I like to kind of look at an aerial view to see my edges are in the same amount of spread. And then you shift around and then match up this edge right here. And you'll note that the facing is shorter than your shirt, and that's to hide the facing lower edge when we're hemming our shirt. So I just stitch and pin down here. And then when I get up here, I spread my notch and ease that into my collar. And again, that bias of the neckline will stretch and fit into the collar. And this other side, we work our way here, spread our notch, making sure it's similar spread distance than our shirt. And here's a good note that you want to make sure you're not catching your collar up into your neckline seam. It lays flat and down on that angle to create that notch. So just make sure when you get to both of your neckline points at center front that it's laying down. And so now I'm gonna go to my machine and I'm gonna start stitching at the hem. Stitch all the way up, pivot, and then pivot again at my slit notch all along my neckline. Pivot at my notch, pivot again at my center front, and all the way back down. And remember, this seam is at your 5/8 of an inch of seam allowance, not the 1/2 inch that you might have stitched on that first seam. And then we'll know that we will not see that stitching from the right side. And when you reach the 5/8 of an inch mark at your neck point at center front, here's where you're going to pivot. And then I'm just going to make sure things are laying flat, and underneath, sometimes you'll want to just smooth it out. Go to the base of this notch. And then pivot one more time. So after I stitched my facing with my collar, I graded all my seam allowances to about 1/4 inch. And then I also went ahead and clipped into my neckline at various points just to help smooth out the curve. And now it's my favorite part because we get to flip our collar right side out and really see what it looks like. And I like to, again, I like really crisp front edges. So I actually press my facing and shirt seam allowance open and then work my way around the whole collar. And grab that point turner again to really poke out that neck point. Oh, look at how good that looks. And really do not be shy about all the pressing on this collar. At this stage, when everything's nice and flat and open without the sleeve, it's easier to get that nice crisp edge. So I actually take my collar with my hand and then my shirt and facing, and I pull them apart to really separate that seam. And then what I like to do is I like to match the facing shoulder seam and the shirt shoulder seam, wrong sides together, and I just put a pin to hold it in place. Now the pattern instructions instruct you to press this allowance under and top stitch from the right side. You can totally do that, or even just top stitch with this serge edge in place because you won't be able to see it from the right side anyway. But if you don't want top stitching along the right side, what I like to do to hold the facing down in place is actually just stitch in the ditch along that shoulder seam, and it holds the facing flat from the inside. So I'm just going to go ahead and press the rest of my collar and shirt. So at this point, I like to flip it to the right side, and then you can kind of get a sneak peek about what your collar is going to look like once the buttons are sewn into place. So they flip to the right side, comes down here, the overlap, and that looks so good. At this point too, you can also top stitch all around here. And what I like to do is actually top stitch from the facing side, because the facing side is going to be facing up when worn. So you can go ahead and top stitch, but I think I'm just going to leave mine plain for now. And you can also top stitch that facing all around, or stitch in the ditch on your shoulder seams, which I am going to do.